Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we are going to discuss collecting antiquarian books with Joseph Felcone. Mr. Felcone has been an antiquarian book dealer since 1972, buying and selling books that date from the 1400s to the 1800s. He also specializes in out-of-print and rare books about New Jersey. He has the world's largest collection of New Jerseyana, with over 10,000 New Jersey books in stock, some of which he brought in to share with our viewers. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Well, Joseph, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You're a rare antiquarian book dealer. Rare to me doesn't necessarily connotate age, but antiquarian does. What would be the time frame for antiquarian books, or has one been established by the trade organizations that deal with it?
There's really not a specific time period, but one normally thinks of antiquarian books, I guess, as going through the end of the 19th century. 20th century books would be modern first editions.
Okay.
There are dealers who specialize in 20th century books, and normally these are first edition collectors looking for pristine copies of books in the original dust jackets in flawless condition.
Okay.
And they take the dust jacket off and they look to see if there's a 1/4 of an inch tear in the jacket. That's a world I don't inhabit.
Okay, so you focus in on the antiquarian book. So the earliest that they would date to would be from what time period?
Well, from the beginning of printing in the 1450s.
Okay.
Books printed before 1801 are called incunabula,
Okay.
term meaning the cradle of printing. And there are people who specialize and collect 15th century books, incunabula.
Okay.
I have some early printed books. Most of my books are 17th and 18th century English language.
English language, okay.
I deal a little bit in continental books, but for the most part, English and early American books.
Okay. But the very earliest books from the 15th century, the first printed ones, are from Germany, is that?
Well, the earliest printing of movable type was in Germany in the 1450s. It spread rapidly throughout Europe. By the end of the century, there were quite a number of presses throughout Europe.
Okay, so it would be possible from the late 1400s to find books being printed in England?
It would indeed. One could go to many, many booksellers and find books printed before 1501.
And what are the subject matters that they're printing at this time? What are some of the different types?
Largely religious, largely theological. There are Bibles, there are commentaries, but it's largely theological.
Okay.
And primarily in Latin.
In Latin, okay. And what, as far as for collectors are concerned, what are the different types of books that collectors are looking for or that are collecting? Are they specific to printing houses or authors or different subject matters for the books?
All of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Collectors collect books from particular presses. They collect books printed in certain towns, books on subject matter, authors. You may collect Virgil. I see there's a copy of a Virgil here. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of editions of Virgil throughout the centuries. Mm-hmm. So there are very few things that people don't collect within the book world.
Okay.
There are some remarkable, very narrow niches in which people collect.
Okay. And what have you found in your experience in selling books are some of the more popular categories that people collect?
In this country, Americana, author collections, individuals collect authors, Mark Twain, mm-hmm. Dickens, Thackeray, modern authors. As I say, there is almost no limit to what you can collect in the book world.
Then how are values then determined for books? I mean, being that there's so many different types of books out there, how would values be determined?
Well, values are largely determined by the dealer selling the book. By auctions, we have records of what books sell at auction. There are now online venues where one can see what prices are being asked by dealers. They're not necessarily the selling prices. Mm-hmm. The internet has spawned a great many amateur dealers in just about any subject, as you know, the ultimate Wild West being eBay.
Right.
You know, it's full of people having absolutely no idea what it is they're selling, but they describe it at great painful length with wonderful superlatives, and normally they know absolutely nothing.
Okay.
But at the same time, it's a wonderful place to buy things.
Okay. What are some of the preservation issues with books? I mean, I'm sure books that are of any age could have certain inherent preservation issues or condition issues. What would be some of those? Like, for instance, some of the earliest books are leather or have leather covers on them. Are there preservation concerns with that?
Well, there are certainly storage issues. You want to keep them in a relatively stable environment. Early books are bound in pigskin or vellum. When it's dry, the covers tend to cup.
Okay.
Leather bindings, one simply wants to keep them in a stable environment, not terribly dry and not terribly moist.
Okay.
And the average house, we've got a great many books in the office of substantial value, and we have air conditioning and dehumidifier, and that's it.
So what about if books with leather covers are deteriorated? Are there things that can be done to preserve them?
There are restoration book binders, indeed.
Okay.
And there are different kinds of book binders. There are certainly the library binders that one wants to steer clear of.
Okay.
These are folks that for $60 will put a piece of cloth around the spine and put it back together. And there are fine restoration bookbinders who specialize in rebacking books. It's called, where you take the two detached covers and you put a new spine, or you lift the leather and you put a new spine and you tool it again. There's an example.
I was just going to say, I think we have one here.
Right here, this book has been, this is a 16th century book. At some point, this spine was added probably in the 19th century. The covers were lifted, the leather was inserted, and it was tooled with a date and a title.
Okay.
And that is done all the time.
Right.
We do it regularly.
Okay. So this, from 1554, this book, so it has the original cover here, vellum cover, it's just the spine.
Well, these are actually, yeah, this is vellum. This normally would have had vellum all the way around.
All the way around, okay.
But this is a very simple, basic, inexpensive binding done probably in the mid-19th century.
Okay.
And it was much easier to do it in leather than in vellum.
Okay. Okay. Now, you specialize in New Jersey, and in fact, you have the world's largest inventory of out-of-print as well as rare New Jerseyana books. According to your website, you have roughly 10,000 New Jersey books in stock from the 1690s up to modern time period. Can you tell us a little bit about that collection and those types of books?
Sure. I'm a collector of early New Jersey books. I've collected all my life, and in addition to selling rare books, which is essentially what I do for a living, I sell New Jersey books, which are, for the most part, moderate in price, but it's my own personal interest. And I've been doing this for 38 years. And I've got books, New Jersey books from the 18th century, printed books from the 18th century up to the present time. A great many books printed before 1800, a great many books printed in New Jersey before 1800, 1850.
Okay.
They call them New Jersey imprints. These are books with a printer's imprint that will say Woodbridge or New Brunswick or Chatham, or wherever the book was printed.
Okay. And if we just could clarify for a moment also, we're not only talking about books, but other printed material like broadsides and newspapers and what else? Maps?
Almanacs, pamphlets.
Okay.
Maps for the most part were not printed in New Jersey. They were printed elsewhere. They may be a map of New Jersey, but it was normally printed elsewhere.
Okay.
But pamphlets, newspapers, printing began in New Jersey in 1754 in Woodbridge with James Parker. He printed until he died in 1770. It was taken over by a second printer, Isaac Collins, who was a Quaker, came up from Philadelphia to Burlington, subsequently to Trenton. After the Revolution, printing proliferated. There were probably 30 printers at one time operating in New Jersey by the end of the 18th century.
Oh, can you talk for a moment about William Bradford? There are thoughts that perhaps he had printed material in Perth Amboy in the 1720s. So Parker becomes the first establishes the first permanent press in New Jersey. But there may be some thoughts that there were other materials perhaps printed in New Jersey earlier.
Well, in 1723, the legislature authorized the printing of currency, and the press had to be in New Jersey. so the printing could be supervised for obvious reasons. One, when one's printing paper money, you need supervision of the legislature. So Bradford brought a press from New York to Perth Amboy in 1723, printed an emission of paper money. There is one session of the legislature, the minutes of the session that ended in the middle of 1723, that bears an imprint, printed in Perth Amboy, 1723. And for the past 150 years, we've never been able to determine whether indeed it was printed in New Jersey. There's no documentary evidence that he printed it in Perth Amboy, whether he brought an actual large printing press as well as a small press in which he printed the currency. To Perth Amboy, we don't know.
Okay, because he's a New York printer.
He's a New York printer, indeed, Philadelphia originally, then in New York.
Okay.
But it's one of the great New Jersey imprints. It's certainly the first. Whether it was, in fact, printed in New Jersey, we don't know, but it was the first New Jersey imprint. There are about 7 or 8 known copies.
Okay.
I don't own one.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say. The same thing happened a few years later. Samuel Keimer, a Philadelphia printer, came to Burlington to print an emission of currency. In Burlington, he brought along with him his journeyman, who was Benjamin Franklin. There is a session of the legislature printed with a Burlington imprint. Again, we don't know if it really was printed in Burlington or whether it was printed in Philadelphia.
Okay. So the earliest documents about New Jersey, what time period do they date from? I mean, so far we're talking the 1720s. Are there documents that are earlier than that?
We're talking printing now?
Yeah, printing, yes.
Well, sure. The printing in New York. Printing began, and it was in this country, in 1639. But the first printer in the Middle Atlantic states, colonies at that time, was Bradford in Philadelphia, printing in about 1795, 1796. 1695, 1696. The earliest printing, that's a good question. I can't answer that. Within America, the earliest printing relating to New Jersey, I would guess, would be very late 17th, very early 18th century.
Okay. Okay.
Now, there was London printing, of course, proprietary tracts, the promotional tracts touting the settlement in New Jersey. You're familiar with those. Were printed in London and in Edinburgh, beginning in, I guess, the late 1670s.
Okay. So it almost sounds as if all this early printing is government-related. Is that true?
Almost entirely. Printers would print, of course, any job that came to them. They largely made their living by printing what we call job printing, promotional sale advertisements, house sales, vendus, as they were called in the 18th century. Those were privately done. An individual would come to the printer and say, I'm having a sale of my farm, and would you print 100 copies? But for the most part, government printing is where they made their money.
Okay. Okay.
And it was to be the government printer or the king's printer at that period was really the pinnacle of a printer's career in colonial America.
Okay. Now, we talked about James Parker, and you brought in some material on James Parker. Can we take a look at?
Sure. This is one of the earliest New Jersey imprints. This is an Indian treaty. There was a conference.
Treaty of Easton? Yeah, okay.
At Easton, Pennsylvania. The proceedings of the conference between the governor of New Jersey and the governor of Pennsylvania were printed by Parker in Woodbridge in 1758. You can see at the very bottom of the title page the imprint, Woodbridge in New Jersey, printed and sold by James Parker, printer to the government of New Jersey, 1758.
And what would be the value of this?
Probably about $5,000 today.
Yeah. You have one of the earliest magazines that was published, actually published in New Brunswick in 1787.
This is called the New Jersey Magazine. It was the third magazine, I believe, printed in New Jersey.
Okay.
First magazine was 1758. They all failed very quickly. This went through, I believe, 3 issues, but it was printed in New Brunswick by 2 printers who were here for 4 or 5 years and disappeared. We have no idea what became of them.
And what would be the value of something like that?
$500, $600, $700.
Okay. All right. How about newspapers? The earliest newspaper in New Jersey. You brought in an edition of 1778 by Isaac Collins of Burlington.
The first newspaper came out during the war, and it was sponsored by the government, or supported by the government. It's called the New Jersey Gazette. Was printed by a Quaker printer, initially in Burlington. He started it in December of 1777 in Burlington, moved it to Trenton, where it remained on and off for about 15 years. And it's 4 pages, as all newspapers were in the 18th century. This one's a little bit torn.
Okay. And how about almanacs as well? Were those material that was popular in the 18th century for printing?
Almanacs were printed in this country from the beginning of the press. This is the Burlington Almanac, printed again by Isaac Collins in Burlington in late 1771 for the year 1772. Everyone owned an almanac. They were done in very large editions, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 copies. Franklin's printing records survive. We can get an idea of the number of copies. But they told the weather, the tides, all the things that an 18th century individual needed to know. And they were quite popular, and every printer printed an almanac.
Okay. So are these more plentiful than some of the other material that you brought in? I mean, what would be the value of something like that? Is that
in this condition, maybe $600, $700, $800.
Okay. Yeah.
It depends upon how many copies are extant. They are more plentiful than many other early imprints because of the large press run. But at the same time, they were ephemeral. People didn't save almanacs. You saved a Bible. You saved an important law book. When the year 1772 was over, you had not much use for this almanac.
It ended up in the fireplace?
So they were, in many cases, tossed out. Almanacs are highly collected. Many individuals collect almanacs.
Okay, okay. There are, where are the centers of printing then? So far we're seeing places like these somewhat urban areas of Burlington City, Trenton, and New Brunswick. So we're talking Elizabeth, Newark. Are those the very earliest centers?
They were certainly the centers of printing in the 18th century. As the press proliferated in the early 19th century, it spread to smaller towns, Patterson and Mount Holly, and towns of the next level down from the big cities.
Okay.
And by the mid-19th century, with machine presses rather than hand presses, there were presses in towns throughout New Jersey.
Okay, so a city like New Brunswick, after the Revolutionary War, how many printers would be there, do you think?
Probably 2 or 3 in the course of the 18th century, not all at one time.
Okay.
I mean, a town couldn't support normally more than 2 printers.
Okay. You brought in some other items, what seem sort of more rare or specialty items. You have a cookbook, with the first cookbook in New Jersey, which was published in Plainfield in 1839.
Well, this rather scruffy little thing is one of the first 2 cookbooks printed in New Jersey. There were 2 cookbooks printed, one in Newark in 1839 and one in Plainfield, both of which are quite rare. We don't know which one was first. I fortunately have both of them. The other one is a bound book. This is a little pamphlet.
Okay. And how rare is that?
This is very, very rare. There are 2 or 3 known copies. This would be $1,500, $2,000 today.
Okay. What about books for children? You have a token for children, a book that was printed in Burlington in 1772.
This is the first children's book printed in New Jersey. It's called A Token for Children, and it's a rather gruesome account of the conversion, holy and exemplary lives, and joyful deaths of several young children. And that's what we read in the 18th century. It's an English author. Went through many, many editions. This is a rather scruffy copy, bound in handmade vellum covers. But it's quite lovely. It's one of 2 known complete copies.
Okay. And also, you have some city directories, or you have a city directory. You brought in the one from New Brunswick.
I brought the first New Brunswick directory.
Yeah. And I just, personally, I always love city directories. I think they're very interesting to go through the names and see what some of the occupations were, and also the advertisements with the great graphics and clip art that were used in the advertisements.
Directories are wonderful. They're very useful today for research, for genealogical research. As you say, they're full of ads at the rear. Of hairdressers and druggists and apothecary and carriages. Directories in New Jersey began in 1735 in Newark. Trenton came next in, I believe, excuse me, in 1835. Trenton was next in the mid-19th century, followed by New Brunswick. Okay. And as time went by throughout the 19th century, more and more towns had directories.
Right. And how common is it to find
this particular directory is very, very scarce. I've probably had 3 copies in my 39 years. And value today is $600–700.
Yeah. Joseph, you were showing us different types of printed material, and we discussed this earlier about books and newspapers, and you brought in several examples of a broadside. One is a challenging of a duel from 1816. Can we take a look at that and discuss that?
This is quite remarkable. This is a challenge by Thomas Gibbons challenging Aaron and Ogden to a duel. They were partners in the steamship business, originally became great enemies. And it's quite lovely. It reads, "I pronounce your conduct rascally. You interfered in a dispute between Mrs. Gibbons and myself. My friend General Dayton will arrange with you the time and place of our meeting." And this dispute eventually led to the landmark Supreme Court case, Gibbons versus Ogden.
Right.
But it's quite a remarkable broadside.
And that's from 1816.
That's from 1816, printed in Elizabethtown.
And this is something that would be printed and posted around town. You mentioned we can even see on the top where it may have been nailed to.
The nail hole.
Yeah.
These will be posted in public buildings, on the sides of taverns, in public places. And it's the way you spread news before we had newspapers or in addition to newspapers.
Right. And you have a later broadside, but equally important. Yeah.
It's an example. This is an advertisement for the Colored Industrial School for the more practical education of girls and boys. This was a black minister, William A. Rice, who established a school for black children in New Brunswick in 1897. And I think this lasted for a couple of years, and he went to Bordentown and established a rather substantial school for black children in Bordentown.
And so what would be the values for both those broadsides?
This probably $3,000–4,000, quite important. This, a few $100s.
Okay. And you also brought in a history of New Jersey that was printed in Burlington in 1765.
This is the first history of New Jersey. As you say, printed in Burlington, 1765.
When New Jersey didn't have much history yet, right?
And it did not. It was essentially a history of the settlement of New Jersey up through the 1720s. And it's an example of a very important book that's readily available. It's not a terribly rare book. This is a $2,000 book. It's quite readily available. There are probably 3 or 4 copies on the market at any given moment. So it's an example of something one could buy. It's a very important book, early New Jersey imprint, readily available.
And so who printed that?
James Parker.
James
Parker moved his press from Woodbridge to Burlington specifically to print this book.
Okay. And so who do you think he's marketing that book to at the time? I mean, it's not necessarily a governmental printing.
Well, no, he wasn't marketing. He printed it for Samuel Smith, the author, and Smith paid the bill. In fact, the receipt is extant. So Smith paid the bill, and it was up to Smith to market the book.
Joseph, in 2005, a manuscript minute book that had belonged to Robert Barclay, a proprietor of East Jersey in the late 17th century, came up for auction at Christie's and eventually was purchased by the state of New Jersey and is now at the New Jersey State Archives. But you bid on behalf of the state of New Jersey for these documents. Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
These documents came up originally in London several years earlier. I tried to find someone in New Jersey to buy them, was not successful. They were bought by a dealer and sold to a private collector, J. Snyder, who subsequently put his collection up at Christie's in New York. Once again, we had the opportunity to buy them, and fortunately the New Jersey State Archives came forward, retained me as agent, and we were able to buy them.
And so these are minute books from the early proprietors of East Jersey, and Robert Barclay is one of these early proprietors. So it's his personal minute books. And in addition to that, there were maps that were part of that collection.
There were, I believe, 5 maps bound in, very, very rare maps, not in terribly good condition, but they were bound in the book originally. Christie's, unfortunately, disbound the book and sold them in separate lots, sold the 5 maps and the minute book in separate lots. which of course would increase their marketability, and the consignor would do much better.
But as far as an ethical issue, though, taking maps out of bound books is something that's frowned upon?
It's frowned upon, indeed. Okay. You lose the archival integrity that if someone else had bought one or two of the maps, they would be forever broken up. Fortunately, we were able to buy the entire collection, and now they're all in Trenton back together.
Right, and one of the maps is a very early city plan of Perth Amboy.
It is indeed.
Yeah, which
it's quite important. There's a very important New York map. I believe the strongest bidding was for the New York map. Yeah. We succeeded.
In acquiring all the material, even the maps that were removed have now been, well, not physically placed back in, but the collection is whole.
Correct. The collection is there. The volume is exactly as it was, but in separate pieces, and it's in Trenton.
And the price for the material, do you remember what the cost was?
I believe the total price was somewhere in the $550,000, $600,000 range. For all 6 lots.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, I personally think something well worth it.
Fabulous price. The state of New Jersey got a very, very good deal.
Yeah, and something that's around for future historians to study for
It's very important and a wonderful acquisition, and we should be forever grateful to the state of New Jersey to arrange to do this.
Yeah. Now, personally, your interest in books, when did you get started in collecting antiquarian books?
I guess when I was in prep school, I collected all my life bottle caps and seashells and stamps and coins and baseball cards and everything else. And at about age 13 or 14, I was away at boarding school, and I began collecting books, collecting Steinbeck novels. That led to New Jersey books, and I've collected New Jersey books for 39 years.
Do you still have the first book that you?
I still have the first book. Yeah. Yes, indeed.
And not only collecting books, you've written about New Jersey books. You have a book, New Jersey Books from 1698 to 1800, another one, New Jersey Books 1801 to 1860. You've been compiling bibliographies about all known New Jersey printings. There's one you were working on before 1801. Can you talk a little bit about, it's more than just collecting, it's publishing the material about what exists?
I collect really for the purpose of scholarship and to write books about based upon my collection. They are mostly bibliographical in nature, but I enjoy doing primary research. I've worked in every major library in the English-speaking world.
And where can people find more information?
On my website.
Okay. About
me.
Yes. Yeah.
I suppose they could call me, or they could go to my website.
Okay.
We issue catalogs. We have many, many books available on the website.
Okay, and you're a member of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America.
I am.
And I noticed that, so this is an organization that's been around since 1949, and it is an organization where the booksellers don't necessarily pay a fee to be a member. You go through a rigorous screening process.
You do, that's correct.
And you're a member of...
I am indeed.
And also the International Bookseller Association.
Well, each individual country has the equivalent of the ABAA, and all of those are under the umbrella of the International League.
Okay, and so this is an organization that helps to set standards. They have a code of ethics. There's a glossary for different terms within the book field as well. Where can people go to? Are there antiquarian book fairs that people can go to?
There are antiquarian book fairs. The foremost fair in America is in New York every spring. Took place a few weeks ago. There's one in Boston every fall, and there's one in California, alternating between San Francisco and Los Angeles every February. Then there are many local fairs. There's even one in New Jersey. There's a New Jersey Antiquarian Book Fair, which is a wonderful entry-level book fair for someone wanting to see a lot of inexpensive books in one place. That takes place in December every year somewhere in Morris County.
Okay, and so these are book fairs that you attend as well?
I exhibit in the major ones in New York and in London and in Boston and California.
So people can visit you at these book fairs, or they can go to your website as well for more information. Well, Joseph, thank you very much for coming in and discussing antiquarian books and for bringing some real gems and treasures for us to see.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as we discussed antiquarian and New Jersey books with Joseph Felcone. For more information, you can visit Mr. Felcone's website at felcone.com. And for comments or suggestions about today's episode, you can visit the East Brunswick Public Library website at ebpl.org. Thank you for watching, and come along again as we travel on the History Trail.